Hey guys, we're wrapping up this chapter today, and we were talking about how the federal government exercises a good bit of control over the states, and we mentioned the use of federal grants as one way of doing that. And yesterday we were talking about federal mandates. Mandates are pieces of legislation, laws passed by Congress that require states to do something, and if they don't, there are consequences for that. Usually they involve taking away money somehow. They can fine people, fine cities, states, and sometimes hold individuals responsible as well. And we mentioned yesterday the Americans with Disabilities Act that had provisions that required states and businesses to have fair hiring practices with respect to people with disabilities as long as they could otherwise do the job. That provision was not that big of a deal, but the second provision of the law was more significant because it required states to provide handicap accessible facilities in public buildings. So, for instance, government buildings, if you go to any building on the Capitol complex of the state of West Virginia, City Hall in Huntington, it doesn't matter. Even your town governments and post offices will have automatic doors. If they have a second floor, they have to have an elevator. They have to have an elevator so that people in wheelchairs will be able to move about freely in the building. You also have things like the curbs on street corners that have to be graded so that individuals can freely access public facilities or government facilities in that regard. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's not that that was a bad policy, but states were frustrated that they didn't have the resources and the federal government didn't provide them any money. And that's the problem with federal mandates is that they often the federal government will give states orders saying you must do this or else, but they never give them the resources to do it. Okay. No Child Left Behind, we mentioned that too. No Child Left Behind required a number of things, but significantly, it required that states demonstrate or all schools demonstrate AYP, adequate yearly progress. And we measure that through testing, and you have to show AYP from grades 3 through 11. And when you do that, the easiest way to show progress was testing. And so standardized testing became more of a kind of a money-making machine in a way. And so for schools to afford testing, which gets really expensive, they needed money to do this, and the federal government wasn't necessarily um, keen on providing all those resources. So that's very frustrating to states. They're like, hey, you got to show your kids are making progress, which means you got to test them, but we're not paying for the tests. Fun fact of the day, too, if you don't think tests are expensive, check out every time you take the ACT. Those cost, I think, over $100, and AP exams, every AP exam you take costs $100. Think about how much money is involved in testing. All right. So you got federal mandates, you got grants, and we want to talk about a few other key court cases and pieces of legislation that are relevant for us here. Okay, and how they affect the balance of power between states and national government. One of the things that we want to talk about is the Welfare Reform Act. All right. During the 1990s, the amount of money being spent on welfare programs by the federal government was going up dramatically. Okay. And so, what the federal government did was they decided we needed to make a change. The Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, worked with Republicans to reform or change around our welfare program. And so, here's what it did Welfare Reform Act gave states a block grant for welfare programs, saying, for instance, here's the money we're going to give you every year, and you get to decide how you want to do welfare programs like food stamps program or what's called TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. You get to determine what it is that your requirements are going to be for your own welfare program, and they put very few restrictions on it. And so the only things that they put in terms of restrictions on the Welfare Reform Act is you couldn't receive more than 2 consecutive years of benefits, and you couldn't receive more than 5 years of consecutive benefits, or excuse me, you couldn't receive 5 years of benefits overall in your entire life. So, for example, certain welfare programs uh, like for example, let's say person A is receiving food stamps or TANF. they couldn't get more than 2 consecutive years worth of benefits from the federal government from that block grant that was going to them. All right. And on top of that, you couldn't get more than 5 years benefits total. All right. And so they told states anything else, any other requirements for your welfare program, you set it up how you want. Now, those federal benefits go a long ways towards helping out, but states can add money to that if they want to. So, for example, let's just pretend that the state of West Virginia got, $50 million every year for running a welfare program. All right, and let's say the state wanted to add in some of its state tax dollars, and let's say we wanted to add in 10 million. So we'd have 60 million total to spend on welfare programs. All right, and we get to set up the rules to our welfare program, as we see fit. Okay, and to some degree, people are like, wait a second, I feel like I know somebody who is receiving welfare benefits longer than that. And there are people who figure out ways to kind of game the system a little bit. But for instance, one of the things that happens is West Virginia, like let's say person A receives welfare benefits, West Virginia set it up so that they can receive funding from state tax dollars as well. Here is a little graph, a chart from TANF, okay, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. That right there shows you over time, okay, what happened to the number of people in the United States who were receiving TANF money, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And you can see that the trend from 1960 all the way until the 1990s, early 1990s, was that more people were receiving TANF. Okay? But after this legislation's put in, the number declined significantly. Now, it has leveled off a little bit. You're always going to have people who are receiving TANF money. Now, the TANF money, though, you can see that that particular program, where we were having to devote more resources to it because the number of people who qualified for welfare assistance was going up, because every state gets to set their own policy now, the number has gone down. Now, also, too, since the Welfare Reform Act is a block grant program where states get to decide this, it empowers state governments, okay? Whereas the national policy in the past was the national government handled welfare and TANF, and now it's up to states, okay? And some states, for example, like Arizona, Arizona's far more stringent about their TANF money than West Virginia because we have a higher rate of poverty. Fun fact of the day, West Virginia's poverty rate hovers around 18 to 19%. So approximately 1 in 5 West Virginians is living in poverty. Okay, of course that varies a little bit county by county, but by and large, West Virginia is a pretty poor state. All right, and so our state government said we have to be more flexible with TANF money. Okay, so you have a policy, everybody deals with poverty in such a way, but every state gets to set up their own welfare program. All right, let's talk about the Clean Air Act. Okay, moving right along. Look, the Clean Air Act, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what the Clean Air Act is. Right, it's about cleaning up pollution that's going into the air. Okay, and up until the late 80s and early 1990s, people got really concerned because scientists found out that the ozone layer that protects the Earth from ultraviolet rays was slowly being depleted by a number of pollutants in the air, especially CFCs. If you don't know, those are chlorofluorocarbons. No, you don't need to go research it, but these largely came from aerosol cans, and people were basically releasing a lot of stuff into the air that was depleting that ozone layer. And so it alarmed the government enough to where they felt like they needed to make a particular law called the Clean Air Act. And it sets regulations about the types of pollutants that we can put into the air. All right. And there are fines and penalties for businesses, factories who do not comply. And if you take a look at this, I'm not saying you need to understand all these, but you can see things that the things that are being put into the air, the different chemicals, and the ozone, the change in that. Uh, there's going to be a deploy, like things are trending downwards now after the Clean Air Act was put into place, and so we're looking at changes in the air, the atmosphere that are pretty good for society. And here's the point we're getting at with this, okay? The Clean Air Act, this law, who does it really empower? Okay? And it's more the national government. Because, look, is there anything in the Constitution about the federal government making laws related to pollution standards or the air? And the answer is no. Okay? But ultimately, how do you think the federal government rationalizes this? Right? Probably the same way they do everything else. Okay? And I will let you figure that out on your own. All right. So the Clean Air Act is all about trying to maintain clean air, and it's the national government making a policy that's going to affect everybody. All right. And that's something that empowers them. Okay, let's go to our next one here, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the midst of all the turmoil of the 1960s, you had the civil rights movement going on where Black Americans were seeking to gain a measure of equality. Okay, and you can't make people not be prejudiced, but you can make them behave better. All right, and so here's what the Civil Rights Act did. There's really a couple key provisions, but the bottom line is this: is what it did was it established that you can't discriminate against people on the basis of race, sex, or ethnicity. Okay? You can't discriminate against people on the basis of race, sex, or ethnicity. And so things like public accommodations, okay? That businesses, for example, public accommodations like restaurants, not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. And that was obviously a big problem in the 1960s. You had segregated society in the South who allowed businesses to freely segregate, and that was not considered an issue for them. Okay. But society as a whole, the federal government felt like they needed to step in because were states handling the problem on their own? And the answer is most definitely not. All right. So you have this law, the Civil Rights Act, which says you can't discriminate on the basis of race, gender, and ethnicity. And that's a real struggle because, once again, we run into this problem of does the federal government have the authority to make laws about civil rights? All right. Because it's not in the Constitution. Okay. And once again, take a guess what they use to rationalize it. And if you haven't figured it out by now, it's the Commerce Clause. All right. That essentially interstate commerce is affected by this, particularly things like restaurants, businesses, public facilities in general. And what they used to rationalize it, the strongest case was things like bus stops. Back then, public transportation bus was a little bit more common. And bus terminals were always a stopping point on a bus trip. And so maybe you're going from West Virginia to New Orleans, and along the way, you'd have two or three stops at bus facilities along the way. And those bus facilities were considered interstate commerce. Okay. And so the federal government rationalized making the Civil Rights Act on that basis. And so, yeah, we're banning segregation in public facilities. And at the same time, people question, should we be doing that? And the article you read the other day, the excerpt from that said Federalism Revisited, right? The author of that article used civil rights as an example, and he said, "Look, uh, if we left this issue up to the states, you'd have a number of people who were still living in a more segregated society even today." Okay. Now, one more issue to address here, and this one's really tough. So you stay with me on this case and this concept that goes with it. Barron versus Baltimore, all right, another Supreme Court case. And this is another John Marshall case as well. Okay. Go back to the early 1800s, and in the late 1820s, early 1830s, the city of Baltimore was expanding. Baltimore is a port city in Maryland. There's a lot of shipping that comes in and out of there, and the city was rapidly expanding. Okay. And as they built up the city, they were digging up and plowing under a lot of land, getting it ready for construction and development. And in the city near the water, okay, people decided that, hey, once we cut down a lot of trees and we dig up a lot of dirt and debris, what do we do with all the trees and the debris and everything else? And that was a problem. Okay, so set that aside for the moment. In the city of Baltimore at this time was a businessman by the name of John Barron. Okay, and John Barron, he owned a harbor, a pier, okay, where ships came in and docked. And so how that worked was, he owned the part of the harbor there, the pier, and you'd bring your ship in, and basically he would charge you money for landing there, and like a rental fee almost. Okay, and that's one of the ways in which John Barron made his money. Okay, and John Barron's living life, doing business as usual, and here's what happens as a result. The city of Baltimore, remember, they've got a problem. They have been digging up a lot of stuff, a lot of dirt, debris, rocks, trees, etc. And they said, what do we do with all this debris? And so they started dumping it in the water. All right. Well, the problem is this: when you start dumping it in the water, you start lowering the level of the water that ships can come in at. All right, because you're basically making the sea floor higher up and the amount of water more shallow. And they were dumping all this debris in the harbor near John Barron's dock, and all the debris that they dumped made it so that ships could not get into John Barron's pier. It made it unusable, all right? And John Barron is furious about this, okay? And he decides to sue the city of Baltimore, all right? Barron says, "You've made my pier, the way I make my money, you've made it worthless." And he said, "You violated my constitutional rights." Okay? And they were like, "Wait a second, man. What constitutional right did we violate here?" And he says, "Hey, the city of Baltimore violated my Fifth Amendment rights." Okay? And if you don't know, in the Fifth Amendment, it says specifically the government can take your property if they need to for public use, but they have to compensate you for it. Okay? And they don't use this phrase, but it's a phrase called eminent domain. All right? And John Barron says, "Hey, you took my property and made it worthless, and you didn't compensate me for it." And the Fifth Amendment says, Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says that you have to do that. So I demand compensation. Okay? And it's similar to the concept of eminent domain. To give you an idea, in Barboursville, if you know where Merritt's Creek is and where the Target, the Starbucks, and all that stuff is, you have what's called that Route 2 connector, that road that goes up the hill and takes you literally out to Route 2. You can go that way through to Guyandotte or to Lesage and other places on Route 2. But that Route 2 connector, that was a road that was built on land used by by eminent domain. The person who owned the land that they put that road on initially did not want to sell it to the government. And the government said, "Well, we're using it for public purpose, so you have to sell it to us. We're going to compensate you for it, but you're going to have to sell it to us." Same thing here with John Barron. He says, "Hey, you basically took my land and you didn't compensate me." Okay, and this case gets before the Supreme Court and John Marshall, and here's the issue. Okay, John Marshall and the Supreme Court, they actually side with the city of Baltimore. Here's why. Okay, John Marshall said, "Look, John Barron, I feel bad for you. It's clear that the city of Baltimore ruined your pier. Okay, they have basically ruined your property without giving you compensation. All right, but here's the problem with that. The U.S. Constitution and your rights in the Constitution are only protections from the U.S. government. All right? It doesn't protect you from the city of Baltimore or the state of Maryland. Okay? That the U.S. Constitution and those rights, they only apply to protecting you from the U.S. government. It's a guarantee that you're only protected from the U.S. government. And he said, "Look, if you want compensation, if you feel like the city of Baltimore should compensate you and that you have a right to that compensation, you can't look to the U.S. Constitution for that. You have to look in Maryland's state constitution, and there is no guarantee. There is no guarantee for that. Okay, and look, this decision, it definitely empowers state governments more because it says, look, the U.S. government only protects you, or excuse me, the U.S. Constitution only protects you from the U.S. government. It doesn't protect you from city or states. All right. And so, for example, let me describe how that would work. For instance, in the First Amendment, you're guaranteed the right to free speech. All right. And that's guaranteeing that the US government won't mess with your freedom of speech. But it doesn't protect you from the states. Okay? Let's pretend for a second that the state of Maryland didn't have a clause in it in their state constitution about free speech. That means Maryland could make laws that would block your free speech. And this really frustrated people because everyone had always assumed that the rights in the US Constitution would protect you from the US government and it would protect you from all state governments. So they thought that there was a guarantee that since the First Amendment said you have freedom of speech, that meant that, the US government couldn't block your free speech, nor could any state government. And John Marshall and the court are like, hey, I know that people just assumed that, but that's not the case. All right. And here's where things get even trickier. People were like, hey, how do we fix that problem? Okay. How do we make it so the U.S. Constitution protects you from both the national government and the states? And so what they did, a solution to that wasn't found until almost 100 years later. All right. And the solution they come up with was something called selective incorporation.